Okay, so I want to talk in more detail about this concept of net neutrality. And net neutrality is something that I don't think a lot of people are aware of, but I do think it's going to be one of the biggest issues that face us going forward. And I really think that if mistakes are made at this point, and to me it does look like mistakes are being made, that it could have a real effect on some of the things that we've come to take for granted about the internet. So net neutrality, in a nutshell, is essentially this concept of your internet service provider, so the company that provides you internet service. Net neutrality says that your internet service provider is supposed to treat all content equally. So it doesn't matter whether that content comes from Netflix or from Walmart or from CNN.com or wherever. Essentially, your internet service provider would provide you all of that stuff at the same speed and essentially not, charge any more for, extra to have a certain website or whatever load more quickly. So net neutrality is essentially that internet service providers would treat all content equally. And that's essentially where we are right now. Essentially every internet service provider, as of right now, although that's soon to change, every internet service provider essentially treats all content equally. So it doesn't matter, whether you go to CNN.com or whether you go to ESPN or whether you're doing Amazon or whether you're doing Netflix, all of the content is treated equally. A lot of internet service providers, especially the big ones like Comcast and Time Warner, they want to basically be able to charge sites additional money in order to essentially make their stuff download faster. So in other words, like your internet service provider might go into a deal with Walmart and they say to Walmart, okay, hey, you pay us a certain amount of money, and what we'll do is we'll make sure that anytime somebody goes to the Walmart website, it's going to go blazing fast. But if they try to go to Meijer or Target or JCPenney or Sears, we're going to not go as fast on those. And that's, in a nutshell, what this net neutrality issue is about, whether an internet service provider should be allowed to enter into deals like that. And most people like me, who are, I don't know if purist is the right word, but I see this as a very bad idea. I mean, one of the things about the internet is it does sort of level the playing field, where it essentially allows not just the big giant conglomerates, but also individual people to start their own businesses and websites and be able to have them work online the same way as bigger websites do. But if we don't do something to maintain net neutrality, these are the kind of deals that could happen. And Comcast has already entered into a deal with Netflix, where Netflix is basically going to pay them additional money to make Netflix go faster on Comcast cable. And there are other deals like that that are essentially ready to be made. So just to back up a little bit, we need to talk about this term, which is called common carrier. Common carrier actually comes from the days when we just had like landline telephones. It actually comes before that. It actually comes from trains, but I won't go into that. But this idea of a common carrier means that if you're a common carrier, you don't care what is basically going over your lines. You treat everything the same. So again, back in the days of telephone, the telephone system was a common carrier system, which essentially meant that we didn't care, who was making the call, what they were talking about, any kind of thing like that. We essentially treated everything the same. So it didn't matter, if you were General Motors or if you were just a guy, calling from somewhere in rural Nebraska. All of that was basically treated the same. The phone company basically didn't enter into anything and say, hey, if you're talking to, General Motors, that's going to be more money or anything like that. I mean, there were long distance charges, but that was, for everybody. So common carrier essentially means that, you treat all information the same. Now, the assumption that the Federal Communications Commission, which we know regulates things like this, although they actually might not be able to regulate this, the FCC had essentially assumed that internet service providers were considered common carriers, which meant that they could step in and regulate things, for example, to preserve net neutrality. But there was this court case that came about, and it basically, and it's in the book, the specifics of the court case, but the court essentially said, no, internet service providers are not like phone companies, and so you can't regulate them as common carriers. So what has happened now is the FCC has sort of made this announcement that they are going to pursue this idea of an internet fast lane, which I do have some readings and some links you can take a look at about that. But essentially what this means is that an internet service provider can enter into a contract with somebody like Netflix, and Netflix would pay them some amount of money, and then they would essentially have a fast lane, which would mean that Netflix would work really quickly for all the people that have this internet service. And maybe Amazon streaming or iTunes or whatever, that might not work as fast. And so there's been a lot of criticism of this FCC decision, which actually hasn't been finalized yet, but it looks like that's the direction they're moving in. And again, this is I just think that this opens up the door to a lot of bad things happening that are going to basically tilt the playing field on the internet more in favor of companies that have lots of money to throw around and lots of money to pay internet service providers to make their stuff download quickly. So this is essentially what net neutrality is about, and I urge you to take a look at some of the links that I've given you and sort of check it out. I do think that it's a big issue, and like I said, I hate to be like a scary old man, but I do think that there are some really bad things that could happen if we don't work to preserve net neutrality. So the FCC, though, right now is sort of like between a rock and a hard place in essence, because this court case has said that they can't regulate internet service providers the way that they regulate phone companies, for example. But if Congress wanted to, Congress could step in and actually give them the power to preserve net neutrality. However, Congress doesn't really seem willing or wanting to do that. Once again, I hate to make this a partisan issue, but generally speaking, this idea of more internet regulation is something that Republicans are against, just because they tend to be against any kind of regulation. In fact, our local congressman, I'll try to find a link to this as well, our local congressman here in Bowling Green, his name is Robert Latta. He has introduced a bill that basically would prohibit the FCC from putting any kind of regulation about net neutrality onto the internet. He says he wants to preserve a free and open internet, which is, if you look at this issue, is basically the opposite of what this is going to do. Also, interestingly, Robert Latta has taken more than $320,000 in donations from cable companies and other sorts of internet service providers. So, I don't know, skeptical. Don't know where, why he feels that way. Well, it could be because of all that money. But anyway, generally speaking, and I should say that there's a lot of Democrats too that are, not fighting for this idea of net neutrality. But most of the people who are fighting for net neutrality, I will say, are Democrats. So essentially, take a look at some of these links. Think about this. I do think it's a big issue, and I think that it's something that is actually worth becoming involved and fighting for. Oh, and one of the things too, one of the links I've given you is John Oliver, who has that new show on HBO. He did a thing which I have a link to, where he urged everybody to write to the FCC and, you know, ask for net neutrality, and it actually overloaded the FCC website and caused it to crash and other stuff like that. So you can take a look at that. So net neutrality, it's a big issue, I think, and give it some thought. All right, later.